The clock struck 6 in the morning at Windsor Castle. James Morrison pulled on his dark blue uniform and checked his radio one last time. He had been doing this job for 15 years, and every single day still felt important. Today was October 15th, 2023, and something felt different in the air. James walked through the massive stone corridors of the castle. His footsteps echoed off the ancient walls that had seen centuries of royal history. As a senior royal protection officer, he knew every corner, every door, and every secret passage in this place. The castle was his second home, and keeping the royal family safe was more than just his job. It was his calling. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows as James began his routine security check. He always started with the king's private quarters on the second floor. This area was the most protected part of the entire castle. Only a handful of people had access to these rooms, and every entry and exit was carefully logged. But something was wrong. James noticed it immediately. When he reached the security desk outside the king's chambers, the overnight logbook sat open, and as he flipped through the pages, his trained eye caught something that made his stomach drop. The entries didn't match up. According to the log, Officer Thompson had made his rounds at 3:15 a.m., but James knew. Thompson had called in sick yesterday evening. Someone else had signed Thompson's name. Someone had been here in the middle of the night, in the most secure part of Windsor Castle, pretending to be someone they weren't. James felt his heart rate increase. In his 15 years of service, he had never seen anything like this. The Royal Protection Team was like a family. They trusted each other with their lives every single day. The idea that someone on the inside might be involved in something dangerous was almost impossible to believe. He pulled out his small notebook and carefully wrote down everything he saw. The handwriting in the log looked similar to Thompson's, but James had worked with Thompson for 5 years. He knew his handwriting, and this wasn't quite right. The letter T was formed differently, and the signature was too neat. Thompson always wrote quickly, and his signature was messy. James continued his inspection of the area. The king's private study door showed no signs of forced entry, but that didn't mean much. Anyone with proper clearance would have a key. He checked the windows, all secure. The carpet showed no unusual footprints. But then he noticed something that made him freeze. There was a tiny piece of thread caught on the corner of an antique table near the king's desk. It was navy blue, the same color as the palace security uniforms, but it was a slightly different shade than the current uniforms. James recognized it immediately. It was from the old uniform style they had stopped using 2 years ago. This thread could have been there for months, or it could be fresh evidence. James carefully took a photo with his phone and then used tweezers to collect the thread. His police training from before he joined the Royal Protection Service was kicking in. Every detail mattered when someone's safety was at risk. As he continued his investigation, James found more small inconsistencies. A chair was pushed in too far under the king's desk. The papers on the side table were arranged differently than usual. He knew because he had helped tidy this room just yesterday. Someone had definitely been here, and they had tried very hard not to leave any obvious traces. James walked to the window and looked out at the castle grounds. The gardens were beautiful in the morning light, but he wasn't thinking about the scenery. He was thinking about who could have done this. It had to be someone with high-level access. Someone who knew the security schedules. Someone who understood how to move through the castle without being seen by the cameras. The list of people with that kind of access was very short. It included James himself, Captain Hartwell, and maybe 6 other senior officers. The thought that one of his colleagues might be involved made him feel sick. These were people he had worked with for years. People he trusted with his life. James decided to check the security camera footage for the night before. The control room was 2 floors down, and he made his way there quickly. The duty officer, Peterson, was just finishing his shift. "Morning, James," Peterson said, looking tired after his night shift. "Quiet night? Nothing unusual to report? Mind if I take a look at the footage from the king's quarters?" James asked, trying to sound casual. "Just want to double-check something from my rounds." Peterson pulled up the camera feeds on his computer screen. James watched carefully as Peterson scrolled through the footage from 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. At first, everything looked normal. Empty corridors, closed doors, nothing moving except the occasional cleaning staff in the lower levels. But then, at 3:17 a.m., James saw something that confirmed his worst fears. A figure in a security uniform walked confidently through the corridor toward the king's chambers. The person moved like they belonged there, but James could tell something was off. The figure was slightly shorter than Thompson, and the way they walked was different. "Can you zoom in on that person?" James asked, pointing at the screen. Peterson enhanced the image, but the figure's face was turned away from the camera. It was almost like they knew exactly where the cameras were positioned and how to avoid them. This level of knowledge about the security system was deeply troubling. "That's Thompson making his rounds," Peterson said without much interest. Right on schedule, James didn't correct him. He needed time to think about what he had discovered. Instead, he thanked Peterson and headed back to his own duties, but his mind was racing. Someone with inside knowledge had infiltrated the most secure area of Windsor Castle in the middle of the night. They had forged entries in the security log and somehow avoided being properly identified on camera. As James walked through the castle corridors, he realized that this was bigger than just a simple security breach. Someone was planning something, and they had the skills and access to potentially carry it out. The royal family was in danger, and James might be the only person who knew about it. The morning was still young, but James knew that this day would change everything. He had to find out who was behind this before they could complete whatever they were planning. The safety of King Charles and the entire royal family might depend on what he did next. James looked around at the familiar walls of Windsor Castle. This place had been his life for 15 years, but now it felt different. Now it felt dangerous. Someone he trusted had betrayed that trust, and James was determined to find out who it was before it was too late. James couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. After reviewing the security footage, he knew he had to dig deeper. The mysterious figure in the corridor wasn't just a random intruder. They knew too much about Windsor Castle's security systems. He decided to retrace the path he had seen on the camera footage. Walking slowly through the same corridor where the figure had appeared, James examined every inch of the walls, floors, and ceiling. The castle's ancient stone walls held many secrets, and he was determined to find whatever this person had been. Looking for, the corridor led to several important rooms, including the king's private study, a small library filled with rare books, and the portrait gallery. James had walked this path thousands of times, but today he was seeing it with fresh eyes. Every shadow seemed suspicious, every corner potentially hiding evidence. As he reached the portrait gallery, James stopped in front of a massive painting that had hung there for over 200 years. It showed King George IV in his royal robes, painted by a famous artist whose name James could never remember. The painting was beautiful, but today something about it caught his attention. The frame seemed slightly crooked. James stepped closer and noticed that the bottom right corner of the heavy gold frame was sitting about half an inch away from the wall. In a place like Windsor Castle, where everything was perfectly maintained, this small detail stood out like a red flag. James looked around to make sure he was alone, then carefully lifted the corner of the frame. His heart nearly stopped when he saw what was behind it. There was a small opening in the wall, barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. Inside the opening was a metal safe about the size of a shoebox. This wasn't just any hiding place. James recognized it as one of the old royal document safes that had been installed throughout the castle centuries ago. Most people had forgotten they existed, but James had heard stories about them during his security training. They were used to hide important papers during times of war or political trouble. The safe door was slightly open. James pulled out his phone and took several photos before carefully opening it further. Inside, he could see that several documents were missing. The safe wasn't completely empty, but it was clear that someone had taken some of the papers that belonged there. James carefully removed one of the remaining documents and photographed it. It was a letter from the 1800s about royal security arrangements. Nothing that would be dangerous if it fell into the wrong hands today, but still historically important. The missing documents could be anything, maybe more old letters, or maybe something much more sensitive. He replaced the document and closed the safe, then carefully repositioned the painting frame. James needed to report this discovery, but first he wanted to understand more about what had happened. Someone had known about this secret safe and had specifically targeted it. This wasn't a random crime. It was planned and executed by someone. With deep knowledge of the castle's history, James made his way to the security office to research the safe's history. The castle's record-keeping was excellent, and within an hour he had found references to the safe in documents dating back to World War II, according to the records. The safe had been used to store backup copies of important royal correspondence and security protocols, but the records also showed something troubling. The safe had been accessed 3 times in the past month. Each time, the access was logged under different names, but all 3 people had high-level security clearance. James recognized 2 of the names immediately. They were senior officers. In the Royal Protection Unit, one name made his blood run cold: Captain William Hartwell, his direct supervisor. Hartwell had accessed the safe just last week, according to the records. But James couldn't remember Hartwell mentioning anything about historical documents or old security protocols. James printed out copies of the access records and studied them carefully. The pattern was clear. Someone had been systematically removing documents from the safe over the past month, but why? What could be so important about old papers that someone would risk their career and their freedom to steal them? He decided to check the other locations where similar safes might be hidden. The castle records showed at least 12 other concealed safes throughout the building. If someone was targeting these historical hiding places, they might have hit more than just the one behind the painting. James spent the rest of the morning checking each location. Most of the safes were still properly secured and appeared untouched, but 3 others showed signs of recent access. In each case, some documents were missing, and the access records showed the same pattern of high-level personnel visiting these locations over the past month. By noon, James had compiled a detailed report of his findings. Someone with insider knowledge was systematically looting the castle's historical document safes. The thief knew exactly where to look and had the security clearance to access these areas without raising immediate suspicion, but James had also discovered something else that worried him even more. Among the documents that were missing were copies of current security protocols. These weren't just historical papers. Some of the safes contained backup copies of modern security plans, emergency procedures, and even layouts of the castles. Defensive systems. If these documents fell into the wrong hands, they could be used to plan an attack on the royal family. Someone could use the stolen security protocols to bypass the castle's defenses, to know exactly when and where the king would be vulnerable. James realized he was looking at more than just theft. This could be the beginning of a plot against the crown itself. Someone was gathering intelligence, preparing for something bigger. The break-in he had discovered that morning wasn't the end of the crime. It was just the latest step in a larger plan. As he sat in the security office, surrounded by printouts and photographs of evidence, James felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He had stumbled onto something huge, something that could threaten the safety of everyone in the castle, but he also realized that he was in danger. If the thief discovered that James was investigating, they would know their plan was at risk. They might try to silence him, or they might accelerate whatever they were planning before James could stop them. James looked at his watch. It was time to report his findings to his supervisor. He gathered his evidence and headed toward Captain Hartwell's office, not knowing that he was about to walk into a trap that would change his life forever. The ancient stones of Windsor Castle had kept many secrets over the centuries, but the secret that James had uncovered might be the most dangerous one of all. James walked down the familiar hallway toward Captain Hartwell's office, carrying a folder full of evidence that he believed would shock his supervisor. He had worked under Hartwell for 8 years, and the captain had always been fair, professional, and dedicated to protecting the royal family. James trusted him completely. The office door was slightly open, and James could hear Hartwell talking on the phone. He knocked gently and waited for permission to enter. Hartwell waved him in while continuing his conversation, which seemed to be about scheduling security rotations for the weekend. Captain William Hartwell was a tall man in his early 50s, with graying hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. He had served in the military before joining the Royal Protection Service, and his office walls were covered with commendations and photographs from his distinguished career. James had always looked up to him as a mentor and leader. "What can I do for you, James?" Hartwell asked after ending his phone call. His voice was warm and friendly, just as it had always been. "You look like you've had a busy morning." James sat down in the chair across from Hartwell's desk and opened his folder. "Sir, I've discovered something that I think you need to see immediately. We may have a serious security breach." Hartwell leaned back in his chair and gave James his full attention. "Go ahead, tell me what you found." James began by explaining the discrepancies in the overnight security logs. He showed Hartwell the photographs of the forged signatures and the evidence of someone impersonating Officer Thompson. Hartwell listened carefully, occasionally nodding and asking clarifying questions. "This is concerning," Hartwell said when James finished explaining about the security logs. "But it could be a simple mistake. Thompson might have forgotten he was supposed to work last night and asked someone to cover for him without going through proper channels." James had expected this response. Security breaches were serious accusations, and good supervisors always looked for innocent explanations first. "That's what I thought initially, sir. But there's more." He then described his discovery of the hidden safe behind the portrait and the missing documents. As he talked, James noticed that Hartwell's expression began to change. The captain's friendly demeanor seemed to fade, replaced by something colder and more distant. "You accessed a historical safe without authorization?" Hartwell asked, his voice becoming stern. "James, you know that's against protocol. Those areas require special clearance." "Sir, I was investigating a potential security threat," James replied, feeling confused by Hartwell's reaction. "I thought you would want to know immediately if someone was stealing royal documents." Hartwell stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the castle grounds. "James, I appreciate your dedication, but sometimes enthusiasm can cloud judgment. Are you certain these documents were actually stolen? Maybe they were moved for legitimate reasons." James felt his heart sinking. This wasn't the reaction he had expected at all. "Sir, I checked the access records. Someone has been systematically visiting these safes over the past month. The pattern suggests coordinated theft." "Access records can be misleading," Hartwell said without turning around. "Senior staff often need to review historical documents for various reasons. Just because you weren't informed doesn't mean the activities were unauthorized." James opened his mouth to mention that Hartwell's own name was in the access records, but something made him hesitate. The captain's body language had changed completely. His shoulders were tense, and his voice had taken on a tone that James had never heard before. "Sir, with respect, I think we should investigate this further," James said carefully. "If there's an innocent explanation, then a proper investigation will prove that. But if someone is really stealing royal security documents, we need to stop them before they can use that information to harm the royal family." Hartwell turned around slowly. His face was pale and his eyes were cold. "James, I'm going to give you some advice. Sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs lie. You've done good work here, but I think you're seeing patterns that don't really exist." "Captain, I have photographs of everything," James said, pulling out his phone. "The evidence is clear. Someone broke into multiple safes and stole documents that include current security protocols." Before James could show him the photos, Hartwell walked quickly to his desk and picked up his phone. "I need to make a call," he said. "Wait here." James watched in growing confusion as Hartwell dialed a number and spoke in a low voice that James couldn't quite hear. But he caught a few words that made his blood run cold. Problem, evidence, and handle it. When Hartwell hung up, he turned to James with an expression that was completely different from the friendly mentor James had known for 8 years. "James, I'm going to need you to delete those photographs and forget about this entire investigation." "Sir?" James couldn't believe what he was hearing. I don't understand. Why would you want me to ignore evidence of a security breach? Because sometimes the cure is worse than the disease, Hartwell said coldly. Sometimes investigating the wrong thing can cause more problems than it solves. James felt like he was in a nightmare. The man he had trusted and respected for years was telling him to ignore evidence that could prevent an attack on the royal family. Nothing made sense anymore. Captain, I can't do that, James said, standing up from his chair. My job is to protect the royal family, and that's exactly what I'm trying to do. Hartwell's face hardened. Your job is to follow orders, and I'm ordering you to drop this investigation immediately. Sir, I think you're making a mistake, James said, his voice shaking slightly. If we don't investigate this, someone could get hurt. The only person who's going to get hurt is you if you don't listen to what I'm telling you, Hartwell replied. There was something in his voice that sounded almost like a threat. James realized with growing horror that Captain Hartwell wasn't just refusing to investigate the theft. He was actively trying to cover it up. The man he had trusted for years was involved in whatever was happening at Windsor Castle. Sir, I think I should report this to someone higher up the chain of command, James said, trying to keep his voice steady. Hartwell laughed, but there was no humor in it. James, you have no idea how high up this goes. You're in way over your head. James felt his world falling apart. If Hartwell was involved in the theft, and if other senior officials were also involved, then James might be the only person standing between the royal family and whatever was being planned. I'm sorry, Captain, James said, backing toward the door. But I took an oath to protect the crown, and that's what I'm going to do. As James reached for the door handle, Hartwell picked up his phone again. Yes, it's me, he said into the receiver. We have a problem. James Morrison knows too much, and he won't listen to reason. You need to handle this before he talks to anyone else. James ran from the office, his mind racing. He had thought he was investigating a crime, but now he realized he had uncovered a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of royal security. And now they knew that he knew. As he hurried through the castle corridors, James realized that his life had just changed forever. He was no longer just a royal protection officer doing his job. He was now the only thing standing between the crown and a plot that could destroy everything he had sworn to protect. James had barely made it back to his quarters when his radio crackled to life. The voice was formal and urgent. Officer Morrison, report to the King's private study immediately. This is a direct royal summons. His heart sank. A direct royal summons was extremely rare and usually meant something very serious had happened. James knew this had to be connected to his confrontation with Captain Hartwell. Somehow, in the space of just 30 minutes, his investigation had reached the highest levels of the royal household. James straightened his uniform and checked his appearance in the mirror. Despite everything that had happened, he still took pride in his professional appearance. If he was going to face King Charles, he would do it with dignity and respect. Even if his career was about to end. The walk to the King's private study felt like the longest journey of his life. James passed other security officers in the corridors, and he wondered if they knew what was happening. Some nodded politely, others avoided eye contact. Word traveled fast in the royal household, and James suspected that rumors were already spreading. Outside the King's study, 2 senior palace officials were waiting. James recognized them both, Sir Richard Pemberton, the King's private secretary, and Lady Catherine Wells, who handled internal security matters for the royal household. Their expressions were serious and disapproving. Officer Morrison, sir, Richard said in his precise, upper-class accent. You are to wait here until His Majesty is ready to see you. You will speak only when spoken to, and you will answer all questions truthfully and completely. James nodded. Yes, sir, I understand. The door to the study opened, and Captain Hartwell emerged. He looked at James with an expression of disappointment and something that might have been pity. James, he said quietly, I tried to warn you. Sometimes good intentions lead to bad outcomes. Before James could respond, Sir Richard gestured for him to enter the study. The room was magnificent, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, antique furniture, and portraits of previous monarchs looking down from the walls. King Charles sat behind a large mahogany desk, wearing a dark suit and looking every inch the serious monarch. James had seen the king many times during his years of service, but this was only the second time he had been in the same room with him. The first time had been during a commendation ceremony 3 years ago. This time felt very different. "Your Majesty," James said, bowing respectfully as he had been trained to do. "Officer Morrison," the king replied, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of royal authority. "Please, sit down." James took the chair that had been placed in front of the desk. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room watching him. Besides the king, Captain Hartwell was present, along with Sir Richard, Lady Catherine, and 2 other palace officials James didn't recognize. King Charles picked up a folder from his desk and opened it. "Officer Morrison, I have been informed that you have made some very serious allegations against members of my staff. Allegations that, if true, would suggest a massive failure of our security systems." "Yes, Your Majesty," James replied. "I discovered evidence of unauthorized access to restricted areas and the theft of sensitive documents from concealed safes throughout the castle." The king looked up from the folder. "Captain Hartwell has explained to me that you accessed these areas without proper authorization and that your conclusions may be based on incomplete information. He suggests that your enthusiasm may have led you to see conspiracies where none exist." James felt his heart racing. Hartwell had gotten to the king first and had painted James as an overzealous officer making false accusations. "Your Majesty, I have photographic evidence of everything I discovered. The missing documents include current security protocols that could be used to plan an attack on your family." "Photographic evidence that was obtained through unauthorized access to restricted areas," Sir Richard interjected. "Evidence that may have been misinterpreted by someone without the proper security clearance to understand what he was seeing." James looked around the room and realized that everyone except him seemed to be reading from the same script. They had already decided that he was wrong, and nothing he said was going to change their minds. "Your Majesty," James said, trying to keep his voice calm and respectful, "I believe someone within your security team is planning to harm you or your family. I know how serious this accusation is, but I wouldn't make it unless I was certain." King Charles studied James carefully. "Officer Morrison, Captain Hartwell tells me that you have been under considerable stress lately, that you have been working long hours and may not be thinking clearly. He's concerned about your mental state." James felt like he had been punched in the stomach. They were questioning his mental health to discredit his discoveries. "Your Majesty, I am thinking clearly. I know what I found, and I know what it means." "Captain Hartwell also tells me," the king continued, "that when he tried to counsel you about proper procedures, you became agitated and made accusations against him personally. This is very concerning behavior from a senior member of my protection team. Your Majesty, Captain Hartwell was trying to cover up the investigation," James said desperately. "His name appears in the access records for the safes that were robbed. He's involved in whatever is happening here." The room fell silent. King Charles looked at Captain Hartwell, who stepped forward with an expression of patient concern. "Your Majesty," Hartwell said, "this is exactly what I was afraid of. Officer Morrison has convinced himself that normal security activities are somehow sinister. Yes, I accessed those safes as part of a routine security audit that was authorized by Lady Catherine's office 2 months ago. The documents weren't stolen. They were relocated to more secure storage as part of updated protocols." Lady Catherine nodded. "That's correct, Your Majesty. The security audit was my initiative. Officer Morrison wasn't informed because it was classified at a level above his clearance." James felt his world collapsing around him. They had an answer for everything. Either they were telling the truth and he had made a terrible mistake, or they were all involved in the conspiracy and were lying to protect themselves. King Charles closed the folder and looked directly at James. "Officer Morrison, I have known Captain Hartwell for over a decade. He has served my family with distinction and honor. Lady Catherine has been responsible for our security for even longer. These are people I trust with my life and the lives of my family. Your Majesty, please, James said. Just look at the evidence. Let someone independent investigate what I found. The evidence, Sir Richard said coldly, was obtained through unauthorized means by an officer who may be suffering from paranoid delusions. Evidence obtained in such a manner cannot be trusted. King Charles stood up, and everyone else in the room immediately stood as well. Officer Morrison, the king said with finality, I have made my decision. You are hereby relieved of duty pending a full investigation into your conduct and your fitness for service. You will surrender your badge, your weapon, and all royal identification immediately. James felt like he was watching his life fall apart in slow motion. Your Majesty, you're making a mistake. Someone is planning to hurt you, and I may be the only person who can stop them. Officer Morrison, the king said firmly, you will be detained here at the castle while we determine the extent of your problems. Perhaps with proper rest and medical attention, you will come to understand that your fears are unfounded. James looked around the room one last time. Every face showed the same expression of disappointed certainty. They all believed that he was mentally unstable, or they were all part of the conspiracy to destroy him. As palace security officers moved to escort him from the room, James realized that he had one last chance to reach the king directly. But it would cost him everything, and it might not even work. The weight of his 15 years of loyal service pressed down on him as he prepared to make the most important decision of his life. The palace security officers moved with practiced efficiency. James recognized both of them, Officer David Chun and Officer Michael O'Brien, men he had worked alongside for years. They had trained together, shared meals together, and trusted each other with their lives during countless security operations. Now they were here to arrest him. James, Officer Chun said quietly as he approached, I need your badge and weapon. Please don't make this harder than it has to be. The sadness in Chun's voice was genuine. These men didn't want to be doing this, but they were following orders from the king himself. In the Royal Protection Service, orders from the monarch were absolute and unquestionable. James slowly reached for his badge, the small piece of metal that had represented his identity for 15 years. As he unclipped it from his uniform, he remembered the day he had first received it. He had been so proud, so honored to be chosen to protect the royal family. That young man seemed like a stranger now. My weapon is in my quarters, James said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll need to go there to retrieve it. We'll escort you, O'Brien said professionally. His face showed no emotion, but James could see the discomfort in his eyes. Standard procedure. King Charles watched the proceedings with a mixture of sadness and stern resolve. Officer Morrison, he said, I want you to know that this gives me no pleasure. You have served my family faithfully for many years. I hope that with proper treatment, you will come to understand that your concerns, while well-intentioned, were misguided. James wanted to scream, to shake the king and make him understand the danger he was in. But royal protocol demanded respect and silence. Yes, Your Majesty, he managed to say. Captain Hartwell stepped forward as the other officers prepared to lead James away. James, he said, his voice filled with what sounded like genuine concern, I hope you'll take this time to reflect on what's really happening here. Sometimes our dedication can become unhealthy obsession. There are people here who can help you work through these feelings. The way Hartwell spoke made James's skin crawl. The captain was playing his role perfectly, the concerned supervisor, trying to help a troubled subordinate. But James could see something cold and calculating behind Hartwell's eyes. As they began to leave the king's study, James took one last look around the room. The portraits of previous monarchs seemed to be watching him with disapproval. The heavy furniture and ancient books that had witnessed centuries of royal history now felt like witnesses to his downfall. The walk through the castle corridors to James's quarters was a nightmare. Word had spread quickly through the staff, and James could feel eyes watching him from every doorway and window. Some looked sympathetic, others confused, and a few seemed satisfied, as if they had always suspected something was wrong with him. James's quarters were small but comfortable. A bedroom, a small sitting area, and a bathroom. After 15 years of faithful service, this modest space had been his home within the castle. Now it felt like a crime scene being searched by investigators. Officer Chun watched as James opened his weapons locker and removed his service pistol. The gun felt heavy in his hands, and for a moment James thought about how different his life might have been if he had never discovered the forged security logs that morning. "Ammunition too," O'Brien said gently, "all of it." James handed over his weapon and the spare magazines he kept in the locker. As he did, he noticed Chun discreetly photographing everything with his phone. They were building a case against him, documenting every step of his removal from service. "Radio," Chun said, holding out his hand. The radio was the hardest thing to give up. It represented his connection to the security team, his ability to help protect the royal family. As James unclipped it from his belt, he felt truly alone for the first time in 15 years. "James," O'Brien said quietly, "is there anything else you want to tell us? Anything that might help explain what happened today?" James looked at his former colleagues and realized they genuinely believed they were helping him. They thought he had suffered some kind of mental breakdown and needed professional help. The conspiracy was so well crafted that even these good men couldn't see the truth. "There's nothing wrong with my mind," James said firmly. "Everything I discovered today was real. Someone is planning to harm the royal family, and by removing me, you're helping them succeed." Chun and O'Brien exchanged glances. James could see they didn't believe him, but they weren't cruel enough to argue with someone they thought was mentally ill. "We need to search your quarters," Chun said apologetically. "Standard procedure when someone's security clearance is revoked?" James sat on his bed and watched as the two officers carefully went through his belongings. They were professional and respectful, treating his personal items with care. But it was still humiliating to watch strangers examine his private life, looking for evidence of whatever they thought was wrong with him. They found nothing suspicious, of course. James had always been a model officer, and his quarters reflected that: no contraband, no signs of mental instability, no evidence of any wrongdoing. Just the modest possessions of a dedicated man who had devoted his life to serving others. "That's everything," O'Brien said when they finished. "James, we need to escort you to the holding area now." The holding area was actually a guest room in one of the castle's towers, but James knew it would be locked from the outside. He was being imprisoned in the place he had spent 15 years protecting. As they walked through the castle one more time, James tried to memorize every detail. If this was going to be his last time walking these corridors as a free man, he wanted to remember everything. The way the afternoon light streamed through the ancient windows, the sound of his footsteps echoing off the stone walls, the familiar smell of old wood and centuries of history, but most of all, James was thinking about the real criminals who were watching from somewhere in the castle. They had succeeded in neutralizing the one person who could expose their plan. They had turned the king against him and convinced everyone that he was mentally unstable. James realized that his removal from the security team was probably the final step before whatever they were planning. With him out of the way, there would be no one left who knew about the stolen documents or the forged security logs. As they reached the tower room where he would be held, James made a decision. He had one last chance to warn the king, but it would require him to break royal protocol in a way that could destroy any remaining credibility he had. Officer Chun unlocked the door to the guest room. "James," he said, "someone will bring you dinner later. Is there anything you need right now?" James looked at his former colleagues one last time. These were good men doing their duty, but they had no idea they were helping a conspiracy succeed. "Yes," James said quietly. "I need you to remember that I tried to warn everyone. When this is all over, I want you to remember that I tried to do the right thing." Chun and O'Brien looked confused, but they nodded politely. "We'll remember," Chun said as the door closed behind them, and James heard the lock click into place. He walked to the window and looked out at the castle grounds. Somewhere out there, the real conspirators were celebrating their victory. They had successfully isolated and discredited the one person who could stop them, but James wasn't finished. Yet, he still had one card left to play, and he was going to use it even if it cost him everything he had left. James spent the next 2 hours pacing in his locked room, his mind racing through everything that had happened. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the tower window. He knew that time was running out for him, and possibly for the royal family. Around 6 o'clock, he heard voices in the corridor outside his door. Multiple people were approaching, and James could make out the formal tones of palace officials. His heart began to pound as he realized this might be his last opportunity to reach the king. The lock clicked, and the door opened to reveal Sir Richard Pemberton, flanked by 2 security officers. "Officer Morrison," Sir Richard said in his crisp official voice, "His Majesty has decided that you will be transferred to a medical facility for evaluation. You are to be escorted from the castle immediately." James felt panic rising in his chest. Once they removed him from Windsor Castle, he would never get another chance to warn the king. The conspirators would be free to carry out whatever they had planned, and no one would ever know the truth. "I request to speak with His Majesty one." "More time," James said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Just for a moment, please." Sir Richard's expression was cold and unsympathetic. "That's not possible. His Majesty has made his decision, and it is final. You will come with us now." As the security officers moved to escort him from the room, James made a desperate decision. He had to try something, anything, to get the king's attention one more time, even if it meant completely destroying what little credibility he had left. "I'm not going anywhere until I speak to the king," James shouted as loudly as he could. His voice echoed through the stone corridors of the ancient castle. "Your Majesty! Please, just listen to me for 1 minute." The security officers immediately moved to restrain him, but James continued shouting. "The stolen documents! Check the bank accounts! Follow the money!" "Silence him!" Sir Richard ordered, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "This is completely inappropriate behavior." But James's desperate gambit worked. His shouting had carried through the castle corridors, and within minutes, King Charles himself appeared in the doorway. The king looked stern and displeased, but James could see curiosity in his eyes as well. "What is the meaning of this disturbance?" the king demanded. "Officer Morrison, this behavior is completely unacceptable." James saw his chance and took it, even though he knew it would probably be his last. "Your Majesty, I'm begging you. Just give me 30 seconds to explain what I discovered. 30 seconds, and then I'll go quietly." The king looked at Sir Richard, who was shaking his head disapprovingly. "Your Majesty, this man is clearly having a psychological episode. He should not be indulged." But something in James's voice must have reached the king, because he held up his hand for silence. 30 seconds, he said firmly. "But if you waste my time with more wild accusations, you will be removed immediately and face additional charges for this outburst." James took a deep breath. He had one chance to save the royal family and himself. Everything depended on what he said in the next 30 seconds. "Your Majesty," James began, speaking as clearly and calmly as he could manage, "someone has been systematically stealing royal documents for weeks. The thief knew exactly where the hidden safes were located and had the security clearance to access them without suspicion. The stolen documents include current security protocols that could be used to plan an attack on your family." "Officer Morrison," the king interrupted, "Captain Hartwell has already explained." "Your Majesty, check Hartwell's accounts," James said urgently, speaking over the king in a breach of protocol that made everyone in the corridor gasp. "The stolen documents contain evidence of financial irregularities. Captain Hartwell has been selling royal security information to tabloid journalists for 2 years. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Everyone in the corridor froze, and James could hear his own heart beating in the sudden silence. "King." Charles stared at James with an expression that was impossible to read. "What did you just say?" James knew he had crossed the line by interrupting the king, but he pressed on. "Captain Hartwell has been taking money from newspapers and magazines in exchange for inside information about royal security. The documents he stole contain evidence of his financial crimes, and he's been trying to destroy that evidence before anyone discovers what he's done." Sir Richard stepped forward angrily. Your Majesty, this is clearly the delusional ranting of a man who— Sir Richard, the king said quietly, please be silent for a moment. James could see something changing in the king's expression. The confident certainty was being replaced by doubt and concern. Officer Morrison, the king said slowly, you are accusing Captain Hartwell, a man I have trusted for over a decade, of treason and theft. Do you understand how serious this accusation is? Yes, Your Majesty, James replied. I understand that if I'm wrong, my life is over. But I also understand that if I'm right and I don't speak up, your life could be in danger. The king was quiet for a long moment, studying James's face carefully. You mentioned financial irregularities. What exactly are you claiming? James felt a surge of hope. The king was actually listening to him. Your Majesty, Captain Hartwell has been living beyond his means for the past 2 years. New car, expensive holidays, home renovations that would cost more than his annual salary. The stolen documents contained records of payments he received from media companies for information about royal security arrangements. That's preposterous, Sir Richard exclaimed. Your Majesty, you cannot seriously be considering— But King Charles held up his hand again, and Sir Richard fell silent. The king was thinking, and James could see him remembering things that had puzzled him before. There have been security leaks, the king said quietly, almost to himself. Private information that somehow reached the newspapers. Details about our schedules and security arrangements that only senior staff would know. James nodded eagerly. Yes, Your Majesty. And Captain Hartwell was in a position to know all of that information. He's been selling it piece by piece, and the stolen documents prove it. The king looked at James for what felt like an eternity. James could see him weighing everything he had been told against everything he thought he knew about the people he trusted. Finally, King Charles spoke. Officer Morrison, if you are lying to me about this, you will face the full consequences of the law. But if you are telling the truth— He paused and looked around at the assembled officials. If you are telling the truth, then someone I trusted with my family's safety has betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. James felt tears of relief building in his eyes. Your Majesty, I swear to you that everything I've told you is the truth. I have photographic evidence of everything I discovered, and I'm willing to submit to any investigation you order. The king turned to Sir Richard. I want Captain Hartwell's financial records reviewed immediately. I want an independent investigation of Officer Morrison's claims, and I want to see this photographic evidence he mentioned. As the palace officials began making phone calls and issuing orders, James felt the weight of the world lifting from his shoulders. He had done it. He had reached the king and convinced him to investigate the truth, but he also knew that Captain Hartwell and his accomplices wouldn't give up without a fight. The real danger was just beginning. King Charles stood in the corridor for a moment, his mind clearly working through the implications of what James had told him. The silence was heavy, broken only by the distant sounds of the castle's daily operations continuing around them. Sir Richard, the king said finally, I want you to locate Captain Hartwell immediately. Do not let him leave the castle grounds, but do not alarm him either. Tell him I need to see him about routine security matters. Sir Richard looked uncomfortable with the request, but he nodded and pulled out his phone to make the necessary calls. As he spoke quietly into the device, the king turned back to James. Officer Morrison, you mentioned photographic evidence. I want to see it now. James felt a moment of panic. His phone had been taken when he was relieved of duty, along with all his other personal items. Your Majesty, my phone was confiscated when I was arrested. The photographs are stored on that device. The king looked at one of the security officers who had been standing nearby. Retrieve Officer Morrison's personal effects immediately. Bring them to my private study. As the officer hurried away, King Charles continued to study James's face. Officer Morrison, I want you to understand something. If your accusations prove false, if this is all the product of stress or mental illness, as others have suggested, you will face serious consequences. False accusations against senior staff are not taken lightly. I understand, Your Majesty, James replied. I'm prepared to accept whatever consequences come from speaking the truth. The king nodded slowly. Then let us go to my study and examine this evidence you claim to have. The group moved through the castle corridors toward the king's private study. James noticed that additional security officers had appeared, though they tried to remain discreet. Word was spreading through the castle that something serious was happening. In the study, the king took his seat behind the large mahogany desk, while Sir Richard and two other palace officials arranged themselves nearby. James stood in the center of the room, still technically under arrest, but now being treated more like a witness than a prisoner. Within minutes, the security officer returned with James's confiscated belongings, including his phone. The king gestured for James to retrieve it. Show me these photographs, the king commanded. James's hands were shaking slightly as he unlocked his phone and navigated to the camera roll. He found the images he had taken that morning, it felt like a lifetime ago now, and approached the king's desk. This is the forged entry in the security log, James said, showing the king the first photograph. You can see that someone tried to copy Officer Thompson's handwriting, but the signature is different from Thompson's real signature. The king examined the image carefully, then looked up at Sir Richard. Do we have examples of Officer Thompson's genuine signature for comparison? Sir Richard nodded and sent another staff member to retrieve Thompson's personnel file. While they waited, James showed the king the photographs of the hidden safe behind the portrait. This safe contained historical documents and backup copies of current security protocols, James explained. Someone had been systematically removing documents over the past month. The king studied the images of the safe and the missing document spaces. How did you know where to find this safe? It's not marked on any current castle plans. I noticed the portrait frame was crooked, Your Majesty. When I investigated, I found the hidden opening. I researched the castle's historical records and found references to these concealed safes from World War II. When Thompson's personnel file arrived, the king compared the genuine signature with the forged entry in the security log. The difference was subtle but clear once you knew what to look for. The handwriting is similar, but you're right, the king said quietly. The signature in the log is not genuine. James felt a surge of vindication, but he knew the real proof was yet to come. Your Majesty, the most important evidence is in the access records for the hidden safes. They show a pattern of visits by senior staff members, including Captain Hartwell. Sir Richard had been making phone calls while James presented his evidence, and now he approached the king's desk with a grim expression. Your Majesty, Sir Richard said quietly, I've spoken with the head of palace security. Captain Hartwell cannot be located. His office is empty, and his duty sergeant says he left the castle about an hour ago, claiming he had a family emergency. The king's face darkened. An hour ago? That was shortly after Officer Morrison was detained. Yes, Your Majesty. It appears. He left immediately after the meeting in your study. James felt his heart racing. Your Majesty, he's destroying evidence. If he's really been selling information to the press, he'll be trying to eliminate anything that could prove his guilt. The king stood up from his desk and walked to the window, looking out at the castle grounds. Sir Richard, I want you to contact our financial investigators immediately. I want Captain Hartwell's bank records, credit card statements, and any other financial information available. I want to know where every penny of his income has come from for the past 2 years. Yes, Your Majesty, I'll arrange that immediately. As Sir Richard made more phone calls, the king turned back to James. Officer Morrison, assuming your accusations prove correct, how do you think Captain Hartwell was able to maintain this deception for so long? James had been thinking about this question since his confrontation with Hartwell. Your Majesty, he was in the perfect position to control information. As head of security, he could explain away discrepancies, redirect investigations, and ensure that any evidence of his crimes never reached the right people. He probably chose his targets carefully, selling information that wouldn't immediately compromise your safety, but that would be valuable to journalists. But something changed, the king observed. Something made him escalate to stealing documents from the hidden safes. I think the newspapers were demanding more valuable information, James said. Or maybe he was being blackmailed by someone who knew about his activities. The documents in those safes contained evidence of his financial crimes, and he needed to destroy that evidence before it was discovered. Sir Richard finished his phone calls and returned to the king's desk. Your Majesty, I have disturbing news. Our initial financial review shows that Captain Hartwell has received several large payments into his personal accounts over the past 18 months. The payments came from companies that we've now identified as front organizations for several major tabloid newspapers. The room fell silent. The king closed his eyes for a moment, and James could see the pain on his face. A man he had trusted for over a decade had betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. How much money are we talking about? The king asked quietly. Over 200,000 pounds, Your Majesty. Far more than his salary could account for. The king opened his eyes and looked directly at James. Officer Morrison, I owe you an apology. You were right, and I was wrong to doubt you. Your dedication to protecting my family, even when it cost you everything, is exactly the kind of service that the crown depends upon. James felt tears building in his eyes. After hours of being treated like a criminal and a madman, the king's words of vindication meant everything to him. Thank you, Your Majesty, James said. I'm just grateful that we discovered the truth before Captain Hartwell could do more damage. But even as James spoke, he realized that their troubles were far from over. Hartwell was still free, he knew. His crimes had been discovered, and he might be desperate enough to do something truly dangerous. Your Majesty, James said urgently, we need to find Captain Hartwell immediately. He has intimate knowledge of your security arrangements, and he might try to use that knowledge to harm you or your family before he flees the country. The king nodded grimly. Sir Richard, issue an immediate alert to all security forces. Captain William Hartwell is to be found and detained as a matter of national security. And double the security around all members of the royal family immediately. As palace officials rushed to implement the king's orders, James realized that this crisis was far from over. In fact, it might just be beginning. The next 24 hours passed in a whirlwind of activity that would forever change the security protocols of the British royal family. Within 2 hours of King Charles ordering the search for Captain Hartwell, police units across London were coordinating with royal protection officers in the largest manhunt the capital had seen in years. James found himself at the center of the investigation, no longer a suspected criminal but a key witness helping to unravel years of betrayal. His detailed knowledge of castle security and his photographic evidence became crucial tools in understanding the full scope of Hartwell's crimes. The breakthrough came at 11 o'clock that night. Hartwell had been found at Heathrow Airport, attempting to board a flight to Switzerland using a false passport. When arrested, he was carrying a laptop computer and several external hard drives containing what investigators would later discover was a treasure trove of royal security information. Dating back 3 years, King Charles was awakened at midnight to be informed of the arrest. He immediately requested that James be brought to his study, despite the late hour. When James arrived, he found the king looking exhausted but relieved. Officer Morrison, the king said, Captain Hartwell has been arrested. The preliminary investigation of his possessions suggests that your accusations were not only correct, but that the situation was far worse than we initially imagined. James felt a mixture of vindication and sadness. He had worked with Hartwell for 8 years and had genuinely respected the man. Learning the full extent of his betrayal was heartbreaking. What did they find, Your Majesty? James asked. Financial records showing payments totaling over 400,000 pounds from various media organizations, the king replied. Detailed security protocols for not just Windsor Castle, but also Buckingham Palace, Sandringham, and Balmoral. Schedules for royal family movements going back 2 years. And perhaps most disturbing of all, architectural plans showing the locations of safe rooms and emergency escape routes. James felt his blood run cold. Your Majesty, if that information had reached the wrong people... Indeed, the king said grimly. Captain Hartwell wasn't just selling gossip to tabloid newspapers. He was providing information that could have been used to plan attacks on my family. Information that could have gotten people killed. The investigation that followed would take months to complete, but the initial findings were damning. Hartwell had been systematically photographing and copying sensitive documents for over 2 years. He had used his position as head of security to access areas and information that should have been completely secure. More shocking was the discovery that Hartwell had been in contact with several foreign intelligence services. While he claimed he had only sold information to British newspapers, investigators found encrypted communications suggesting that royal security information had also been passed to hostile foreign governments. The man I trusted to protect my family was actively endangering them, King Charles told James during one of their many conversations over the following weeks. If you hadn't discovered his activities when you did, the consequences could have been catastrophic. 3 days after Hartwell's arrest, King Charles summoned James to his study once again. This time, the atmosphere was completely different. Instead of the grim emergency meetings of the previous days, this felt like a celebration. "Officer Morrison," the king said, "I have made several decisions regarding your future that I hope you will find acceptable." James stood at attention, still overwhelmed by how dramatically his life had changed in just a few days. "First," the king continued, "you are hereby reinstated to active duty with a formal apology from the Crown for the way you were treated. Your dedication to duty, even in the face of personal destruction, represents the highest ideals of royal service." "Thank you, Your Majesty," James said, feeling tears of relief. "Second," the king said, "you are promoted to the position of Chief of Royal Protection, effective immediately. The previous structure of our security clearly had vulnerabilities that allowed Captain Hartwell's crimes to continue undetected. I need someone I can trust absolutely to rebuild and strengthen our defenses." James was speechless. He had gone from being detained as a suspected criminal to being placed in charge of the entire Royal Protection Service in less than a week. "Your Majesty, I'm honored beyond words," James finally managed to say. "I promise you that I will do everything in my power to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again." The king smiled, the first genuine smile James had seen from him since this ordeal began. "Officer Morrison, Chief Morrison, I have complete confidence in your abilities. Your willingness to risk everything to protect my family has shown me exactly the kind of person I need in this position." Over the following months, James implemented sweeping changes to royal security protocols. He instituted new background check procedures, created redundant oversight systems to prevent any single person from having too much unsupervised access, and established regular audits of all security personnel. The hidden safes throughout Windsor Castle were all relocated and secured with new access protocols. The castle's historical document archive was completely reorganized with digital backups stored in multiple secure locations. Most importantly, James created new channels for security officers to report concerns without fear of retaliation. He never wanted another situation where someone might discover a security threat but be afraid to report it because it implicated their superiors. Captain William Hartwell was eventually sentenced to 15 years in prison for treason, theft of state secrets, and conspiracy. The judge called his crimes one of the most serious breaches of royal security in modern British history. During the trial, it was revealed that Hartwell had been recruited by a foreign intelligence service 3 years earlier. What had started as selling harmless gossip to tabloids had gradually escalated into passing vital security information to hostile foreign governments. The payments from newspapers had been just the beginning. The real money had come from selling state secrets. James testified at the trial, describing how he had discovered the security breach and how Hartwell had tried to cover up his crimes. The prosecutor praised James as a true guardian of the crown whose courage and dedication prevented what could have been a national disaster. A year later, James stood in the same corridor where he had once been arrested, now wearing the insignia of Chief of Royal Protection. King Charles approached him during one of his regular security briefings. "Chief Morrison," the king said, "I've been thinking about that day when you shouted those 5 words in the corridor. Your Majesty, check Hartwell's accounts, 5 words. That changed everything. James smiled. Your Majesty, I was desperate. I thought it was my last chance to reach you. Those 5 words saved my family, the king said seriously. They exposed a traitor and prevented what intelligence services now believe could have been an assassination attempt. 5 words that required enormous courage to speak. James felt the weight of responsibility that came with his new position, but also the satisfaction of knowing he had done the right thing when it mattered most. Your Majesty, James said, I hope I never have to speak such words again. But if I do, I hope I'll have the same courage to put your family's safety above my own concerns. King Charles placed a hand on James's shoulder. Chief Morrison, I have no doubt that you will. That's exactly why you're the right person for this job. As they walked through the castle corridors together, James reflected on how much had changed since that morning when he had first noticed the forged security logs. He had lost everything and gained it back, discovered betrayal in the place he trusted most, and learned that sometimes doing the right thing requires risking everything you hold dear. The ancient stones of Windsor Castle had witnessed many dramatic moments throughout British history, but few had been as personally transformative as the day when 5 desperate words had exposed a conspiracy and saved the crown. James knew that this story would remain classified for many years, but he also knew that he would never forget the lesson it had taught him about courage, loyalty, and the price of protecting what matters most.